I think we can begin, Caterina. Okay. Okay. Welcome to everybody again. Now we will begin our last section in our workday, and I'm very happy to present our keynote speaker, Professor Leonard Lawlor. He's head of the philosophy department and Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Philosophy at Penn State University. He is the author of several books and articles, most of them about continental philosophy and French contemporary philosophy. And his recent courses were focused on Bergson's and Deleuze's philosophy. He is one of the co-founding members of this international research network, our Global Bergsonism, and he organized the first web seminar of our net research. And in the context of these networks, of the network's activities, Len has completed a work mission at the École Normale Supérieure in the spring of 2022. And we will proceed in this way. He will present his conference. I think he has time. We didn't think about a duration. Then feel free to develop your exposition. I would say some. I will. Talk a very synthetic comment and make some questions, one or two questions, and after I open for the public. It's okay? It's okay like this?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Donc, Len, I'm very sorry about my excitant English. And and for some mixed sentences, I can say French English at the same time, but I think it will be okay. And then thank you so much, Len, to accept to participate with us at this web seminar. And the word is yours now.
Well, thank you, Débora, for the invitation. It's an honor to share my work with you. And apologize to Caterina, who's heard this talk already one time back in May. So, and also apologize, I won't be able to make the Thursday meeting next week because that's the American holiday of Thanksgiving, which is a big deal over here. So I'm going to try to come join on Friday. So. Okay, so title is How to Reach the Absolute, Bergson's Anti-Kantianism. I wrote this as a book chapter for a volume coming out in English on receptions of Kant's philosophy. I wrote the Bergson chapter for that book. This is a shortened version of that chapter, and it is an interest I have. I mean, a twofold interest in how intuitionism has developed over the 20th century in French philosophy, because I do think Derrida's early book, Le Voie et le Phénomène, where he criticized intuitionism pretty relentlessly, is a very compelling book. On the other hand, I find that Bergson's concept of intuition is also very compelling. And but also I'm very interested in this very traditional question of the absolute. So I'm going to talk a lot about Bergson, but I have these more personal philosophical interests in writing this paper. And again, I'm going to talk about a lot of things that all of you know about, but hopefully the way I've arranged them will be interesting and show you something else about Bergson. So I'll talk for about 45 minutes, if that's okay. So late in his career, and I have a screen on my left, so I'll be looking over here at my screen. So, so late in his career, in his 1922 introduction to La Pensée, le Mouvement, Bergson says, we have attributed to science, as to metaphysics, the power to reach the absolute. Even though Bergson is responding in this quotation to the then contemporary critics of his philosophy, it's easy to see this quotation refers to Kant. In fact, Bergson had just finished the prior section of the introduction by criticizing the critique of pure reason. And of course, as you all know, we find criticisms of Kant throughout all of Bergson's writings and courses. And therefore, this is the title, the subtitle I have in my paper. We would be justified in defining Bergson's thought as a kind of anti-Kantianism. As he says in the 1907 Creative Evolution, there is nothing could be more contrary than my philosophy to the letter and perhaps also the spirit of the critique of pure reason. In Creative Evolution, we find the one claim that is the seed for all of Bergson's criticisms of Kant. A short quote from Bergson: there is for him, for Kant, only one experience. In the Critique of Pure Reason, as is well known, Kant argues that human knowledge is finite because experience or intuition is limited to what is given in sensibility. According to Kant, humans have no access to any other sort of experience or intuition. His short quote from Kant: we cannot intuit objects that are not considered as appearances. Intellectual intuition, Kant says, lies outside our faculty of cognition. Really famous comments from the critique. But in contrast to Kant, Bergson argues that we have more than one kind of experience. He argues that we have not an intellectual intuition, but a supra-intellectual intuition. Now, in 1903 Introduction to Metaphysics, Bergson describes the supra-intellectual intuition as un sentiment. The word sentiment, or sentiment, in English, we have the same word, indicates that the supra-intellectual intuition is en sentir. So sentir or sensing distinguishes the supra-intellectual intuition from intellectual intuition. Intellectual intuition is supposed to give us intellectual, non-sensible access to reality. Although the supra-intellectual intuition is an experience, this sensing is not perception. Perception for Bergson looks at things from the outside, is concerned with matter, and is practical. In contrast to perception, Bergsonian intuition is speculative. It looks at things from the inside, is a kind of introspection, is spiritual or mental. The sensing or feeling is self-sympathy, and as you all remember, this is the famous ending of the opening of Introduction to Metaphysics. Bergson says, with no other thing can we sympathize spiritually. One thing is sure, we sympathize with ourselves. Now, if we are supposed to have, according to Bergson, the power to reach the absolute, then the question is obvious. How can we reach the absolute by sympathizing with ourselves? Isn't this intuition the most relative experience? What I'm going to talk about today is an attempt to show this intuition is not relative, and Bergson is right. And saying this for myself as well, I agree with him when he claims that we can gain access to the absolute, or at least make a more modest claim, at least to a version of what we have traditionally called the absolute. I know that most philosophers today will react to this claim with skepticism. Perhaps, however, this reaction is due to the continuing influence of Kantianism itself, or the persistent scientism Bergson denounces in La Pensée le Mouvant. To see the plausibility of what Bergson claims for us, we must believe that not everything is known through physics. Unlike Kant, Bergson thinks that metaphysics is possible. For the sole object of physics is matter, metaphysics' sole object of this investigation is mind. In its investigation of the mind, metaphysics shows us, according to Bergson, that we have different planes, or better, different tensions of our interior life. By contracting and relaxing the tension, we can, according to Bergson, move from the most intense to the least intense. We can move from there it is. So you should scroll down to page 2 if you have it in front of you. Okay. Thank you, Débora. That's very helpful. We can move from a creative act of freedom to the repetition of necessary connections. In other words, we can reach matter and we can make contact with spirit, which Bergson, of course, calls God. We're able to ascend above human experience and to descend below human experience. Therefore, we can reach at least something like the absolute. As Bergson says in Introduction to Metaphysics, this absolute is not a conceptual eternity, which is the eternity of death, but an eternity of life. However, I think what Bergson is referring to with the word absolute, this eternity of life, he's referring to, I think, and I've rewritten this a little bit here just yesterday, actually. What I think he's referring to is a continuity of durations with intuition allowing us to feel ourselves as one duration in a series of durations. Okay. To reach the absolute, we'll start with the key to all of Bergson's thinking, which is qualitative multiplicity. I know this has already been discussed earlier today a couple of times, but I do think it's so important for Bergson's thinking. It's a good idea to go through it one more time. And if you're, seeing or listening to what I'm saying, I said one duration in a series of durations, that makes this an idea about immanence, and the qualitative multiplicity is the heart of Deleuze's own concept of intensity that he develops in different repetition and beyond that period of his thinking. So, but anyway, just to go through, this is a short presentation of qualitative multiplicity. So again, we all know that Bergson talks about time under the idea of duration, and Kant made time be the inner form of sensibility. But according to Bergson, in his very first book, the essay, sur les données immédiates, he says that Kant made an error by conceiving time as a homogeneous milieu. By conceiving time as a homogeneous milieu, Kant understood time to be a form prior to, a priori, and independent of its content. By understanding time as a form, according to Bergson, Kant reduced time to space and therefore to geometry. It's said for Bergson, again, in l'essai, duration is heterogeneous and inseparable from its content. Real duration, he says, is made up of moments inside of one another, and when it seems to assume the form of a homogeneous whole, is because it gets expressed in space. After the essay, in one of his courses at the Lycée, 1893, 1894, on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Bergson says, and this is my own translation in English, Kant's analysis of our personality does not apply to the idea we draw from ourselves in a profound intuition. No matter what, and this is a very strong comment by Bergson, a criticism of Kantianism must make all of its efforts bear on this point. Okay? The criticism must bear on the point that our personality, our person, and therefore our duration is a qualitative multiplicity. Of course, qualitative multiplicity is not a quantitative multiplicity. In, let's say, Bergson describes a flock of sheep as a quantitative multiplicity. But here's the important part. To constitute a quantitative multiplicity, which is always done out of practical or utilitarian interest, one ignores the content of the space the items occupy, which results in the space being homogeneous. In the case of the flock of sheep, one ignores the fact that the pasture in which they are feeding is beautiful, and the fact that the sheep are not strictly identical to one another. One focuses only on what they have in common. What one is interested in is the total number of sheep, be it for meat or wool production. We're able to enumerate them because each sheep occupies a discernible location within the homogeneous field, because they are juxtaposed to one another. Of course, the enumeration of the sheep is represented by a symbol, by a number. Similarly, a calendar or a clock is a homogeneous form of time. His formal measurement of time is what Bergson thinks Kant has in mind with the inner sense of time. In contrast, Bergson argues that if we're able to turn ourselves away from all utilitarian interests, time appears as a qualitative multiplicity, in which the moments flow continuously into one another, and yet are heterogeneous to one another. That's really the genius of this idea from Bergson, continuity with heterogeneity. Again, as you remember, this is in the first chapter of the essay. Bergson gives a number of examples of qualitative multiplicity, and I've chosen one for a specific reason. It's a feeling of pity, and I'll return to this feeling at the very end of my talk. But as you all know, pity is a feeling closely associated with the feeling of sympathy. So, and Bergson in the Introduction to Metaphysics defines intuition as sympathy. So this is anticipating what he says in the introduction. So here he says in the essay, sympathy is a moral feeling. And here's his description, which I paraphrased. Our experience of sympathy or pity begins, according to Bergson, with us putting ourselves in the place of others and feeling their pain. But Bergson continues, if this were all, the feeling would inspire in us an abhorrence of others, and we would want to avoid them, not help them. But then one realizes that if one does not help this suffering person, it's going to turn out that no one will come to my aid when I need help. There's a need to help the suffering. Now for Bergson, these first two phases are what he calls inferior forms of pity. In contrast, true pity is not so much fearing pain as desiring it. This is quite a reversal in the description. Not fearing pain, but desiring it. And here's what he says, is as if nature committed a great injustice, what we want is not to be seen as complicitous with it. As Bergson says, the essence of pity is thus a need for self-abasement, similier, an aspiration downward into pain. But this downward aspiration develops into an upward movement, into the feeling of being superior. One feels superior because one comes to realize that one can do without certain sensuous goods. In the end, however, one feels humility, humble, since one no longer needs and desires such sensuous goods. By denying ourselves these goods, we in a way reestablish justice. And now, later in the two sources, much later, Bergson shows the feeling of pity or sympathy is in fact progresses to the point of love for all things. And if you also remember, if I can just add some things in here, what he describes here about the desire to do away with sensuous goods, it ends up with him valorizing the ascetic ideal in the fourth chapter of the two sources, using the Nietzsche phrase, actually. So here's the summary. The feeling of sympathy is a qualitative progress that consists in a transition from disgust to fear, from fear to sympathy, and from sympathy itself to humility. There's a heterogeneity of feelings here. The feelings are continuous with one another, they interpenetrate one another, and there's even an opposition between inferior needs and superior humility. If we try to juxtapose the feelings, that is, separate them spatially, the feelings would have a different nature than when they interpenetrate. There'd be no progress from one to the other. They'd be isolated psychic states. Therefore, for Bergson, the qualitative multiplicity is heterogeneous or differentiated, continuous or unifying, oppositional or dualistic, and at the extremes, and most importantly, temporal or progressive, an irreversible flow. Bergson also calls the last characteristic of temporal progress mobility, and this characteristic truly distinguishes duration from space, which is an immobile milieu. As we'll see, the characteristic of mobility is important for how we reach the absolute. Finally, because a qualitative multiplicity is heterogeneous, and yet interpenetrating is inexpressible, the continuous and heterogeneous multiplicity of consciousness is given immediately, that is, without the mediation of symbols. And of course, as you all know, he says in Introduction to Metaphysics, metaphysics is the science that claims to do without symbols. And just another additional comment about qualitative multiplicity being inexpressible, but of course, we can understand it through images. So I'll come back to a series of images at the end of the talk. Now, the next section is more on Bergson and Kant directly. I'm going to focus on a course, the 1904-1905 course on the evolution of the problem of freedom, which was published in French in 2017. And I did the English translation of it. It's in production. It should be out in 23 or 24, I hope. And I'm going to focus on this course because as far as I can tell, looking across all the courses and the published works, this is Bergson's most extensive discussion of Kant is in this course, in the final 2 lectures. And the course itself is, I think it's extremely interesting. The first half concerns ancient Greek philosophy from Homer to Plotinus, while the second half concerns modern philosophy from Descartes to Kant. And you remember, this is this course is the first one of the Collège de France when Bergson holds the chair in modern philosophy, no longer in ancient philosophy. So he's trying to make the transition to modern philosophy in this course. But in the first half on ancient philosophy, he shows that ancient Greek philosophers recognized regularities, but their mathematics was not advanced enough to discover the concept of natural laws. In regard to action, the ancient Greeks, according to Bergson, saw no positive value in it. Action's only value was to help us correct our material life and return to the realm of ideal forms. In contrast, the moderns have made advances in mathematics. They were then able to mathematize regularities and conceive natural laws. Similarly, the moderns for Bergson grant to action a positive value, making it something good in itself. While Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz made progress over the ancients, it is only Kant, according to Bergson, who brought to light the very quintessence of the modern conception of knowledge and the quintessence of the modern conception of action. And I'm going to go do this in 2 parts. First, we'll talk about science or knowledge in Kant, according to Bergson, and then we'll go to the action. So the starting point of the critique of pure reason, according to Bergson, is the failure of other modern philosophers like Spinoza and Leibniz to explain the success of modern science, to explain why mechanism works. And while earlier modern philosophers appeal to something outside of nature, God, to explain why mechanism works, Kant places the principle of nature within nature. Kant's great invention, this is Bergson's phrase, says there is a hyphen, un trait d'union, between physics and metaphysics, physics, metaphysics. Like the hyphen, physics is linked to mathematics forming a union. Kant shows that mathematical judgments are synthetic a priori judgments, just as judgments of nature are synthetic a priori judgments. Reasoning about numbers, magnitudes, and figures results in conclusions about objects, because mathematics for Kant are determinations in space and time. Then, as is well known, Kant makes the forms of space and time determinations of our sensibility. Everything that is knowable for us must pass through this prism of space and time. Consequently, our mathematical knowledge is applicable to things perceived. Turning from the transcendental aesthetics to the transcendental logic, Bergson states that the categories of understanding unify and systematize the material determined by the space forms of space and time in our sensibility. By means of the category of causality, the understanding links phenomena to phenomena, objects to objects, regarding an absolutely coherent and systematic unity of nature. Through this unity, science is able to have an unshakable confidence in itself. This systematic unity of nature is the quintessence of the modern conception of knowledge. But as Bergson says repeatedly in his writings, Kant's explanation for the success of science makes our knowledge relative. Now, when Bergson in this course turns to the question of action in Kant, he refers to the solution of third antinomy in the Critique of Pure Reason. And again, if you know the courses, and it's not clear, I mean, I'm not trying to criticize Bergson, it's not clear how much Kant he actually knew. He usually lectures only on the Critique of Pure Reason. And at least by the time of the 2 sources, he He quotes the Critique of Practical Reason, but nothing beyond that as far as I can tell. And that's very late, that's 1932. So here, even to talk about action, he's in the Critique of Pure Reason and the Third Antinomy. Bergson claims that Kant does not assert the existence of human freedom, but he allows for its possibility. Freedom is possible because of the difference between the phenomenal world and the noumenal thing itself. Freedom would be possible according to Bergson's reconstruction of Kant's philosophy, because freedom could lie behind the phenomena of nature. Given Kant's explanation of science, all of what appears to us is determined necessarily or mathematically. If I consider one of my actions, it takes place in space and time. Therefore, my action is explained by the event that preceded it, and that event was determined by the one that preceded it, and so on. However, as Bergson presents Kant's conception, if I consider all of my actions from the beginning to the end, it is possible my actions were sent out into the phenomenal world en bloc, as a whole. And this is not in Kant. This is Bergson's interpretation, possible way of explaining what Kant has in mind. While the phenomenal world is causally determined, this freedom would be a different kind of causality. Freedom would be a causality sui generis, which consists in creating purely and simply the way we are. Since it precedes the forms of space and time, this act of self-creation would be an atemporal act. Well, as we'll see in a moment, Bergson objects to Kant's theory of freedom. He also says that consciousness tells us there's something true in this conception of freedom. Kant's conception of freedom has some truth to it because it corresponds to the idea that when I act freely, I create a new action. In short, the quintessence of the modern conception of action is creation. In fact, Bergson himself defines freedom in this course as the creation of actions that are absolutely unforeseeable, of actions that add something to the conditions on whose basis they are given. Now, Bergson has two principal objections in this course to Kant's conception of freedom. The really big problem for Bergson is this question: how can freedom so understood in Kant come to be inserted into the mechanism of nature without breaking nature's unity? So we just saw for Bergson, Kant's concept of freedom is an atemporal act by means of which the intelligible, not the empirical self, creates itself. This act then projects into time a series of actions or conducts which are new facts introduced into the determinate and necessary connections of nature. These facts, therefore, had to find a place within the natural order. The act would have to find a gap in the connections or a place not occupied by necessary connections. However, since nature for Kant forms an absolute, unified, and consistent system, there is no empty place. Consequently, as Bergson says, this freedom is illusory. In other words, individual or personal freedom, the freedom of you or me, of someone who exists in nature, is not possible in Kant. Only an impersonal or general freedom is possible. The freedom of human consciousness in general, or as Bergson says in this course, no longer are there freedoms in the plural. There is only one freedom. This is the freedom of being in general. Bergson's objection means that there must be contingency within nature, contingency appearing in nature, he argues, coming with all living beings. Now, Bergson's second objection to Kant's conception of freedom is that Kant gives too much and too little to freedom. Kant, according to Bergson, grants too much to freedom insofar as Kant thinks that we absolutely entirely create ourselves. This claim is too much since we sense that there are obstacles to our action and the nature of our character does not entirely come from ourselves. Our character comes about on the basis of certain psychological and hereditary conditions, and the opportunities or lack thereof shape the character as we mature. In short, we are not the complete authors of our character, as Kant's conception of freedom seems to imply. Kant grants too little to freedom, insofar as he thinks that once we choose our character in this atemporal choice, once we have chosen, as it were, a formula for our lives, every action seems to be given within this formula. However, for Bergson, if our freedom is real and not illusory, then there has to be, at least in certain moments of our existence, absolute possibilities for which we choose, like the moment where we encounter a fork in the road and have to choose which path to follow. In other words, to a large degree, we are subjected to our character, but there are moments, and Bergson sometimes calls these existential moments. There are certain moments when we can absolutely overturn our character. I'm going to talk some more about about science and freedom in this course, and then I'll come to the conclusion, which is how to reach the absolute, which I know that sounds very immodest, but see how this goes. So I'm a little over half of the talk now. So as we've seen, Bergson praises Kant for the inventive way he accounts for the success of natural sciences or physics. Or prior modern philosophers had explained the success of science by appealing to God, Kant reduced their metaphysics to a minimum. Instead of God, the forms of the human understanding explain science's success. Even if the understanding in Kant is impersonal, even if it is the understanding of a humanity somewhat deified, the problem with Kant's account for Bergson is that he makes scientific knowledge relative to humanity. Even though Kant gives us reason to be confident in scientific knowledge, he still limits this knowledge to appearances. Reality of the thing in itself eludes us. Bergson criticizes not only in Kant, but also in the entire modern traditional philosophy, the idea of a unified science, a thesis universalis. And again, I don't know whether this claim would hold up in the last 100 years. But at this point, in the early 20th century, Bergson thinks that the development of the social sciences and biology in the 19th century indicate a splitting apart of the sciences. Biology and the social sciences, he thinks, use a different methodology than physics. This is clearly not true today. For Bergson, physics deals with inert matter, while biology and the social sciences deal with life. Now, Bergson's own explanation of the success of natural sciences relies on the fact, as Bergson has shown since Matter and Memory, that human perception and intelligence, both being practical, are geared to action and thus to the manipulation of matter so that it serves our needs. Bergson also argues, and this is one of the main points of the creative evolution, that as humans have evolved, so have their faculties, including intelligence. The evolution of intelligence leads to the natural sciences, which aim to make us masters of matter. Thus, we should have confidence in science for Bergson, because if the intellect has been made in order to utilize matter, its structure has no doubt been modeled upon the structure of matter. In other words, intelligence adapted its abilities to utilize matter the best way it can. Intelligence's knowledge of matter becomes more and more accurate. As it becomes more accurate, the natural sciences for Bergson reach one side of the absolute, the side of matter. Again, Bergson says in the introduction to La Pensée et le Mouvement, we have attributed to science, as to metaphysics, the power to reach the absolute. And as we saw above, Kant preserves freedom in general, but not personal freedom. In Kant, as Bergson says, there are no freedoms in the plural. For Bergson, personal freedom is possible only if there is contingency in nature. As I said earlier, Bergson thinks there is contingency in nature wherever there is life. However, his argument is really based on how he defines necessity. So in this course, 1904-1905 course, he praises the Stoics for their definition of necessity in a very strict way as a truth whose negation is necessarily false. Necessity is that of which the contrary implies a contradiction. But as Leibniz saw, and Bergson praises Leibniz a lot in this course as well, possible actions are not contradictory. Therefore, neither possible action is necessary. Bergson also argues that natural laws can be understood as statistical regularities under which there are irregularities. He then goes on, our freedom takes advantage of the irregularities and thereby passes through the meshes of necessity. Finally, Bergson defines freedom as being the author of one's actions. But unlike Kant, Bergson does not grant too much to freedom. For Bergson to be the author of one's actions is to feel that one's actions emerge naturally from the sensible intellectual states in which one finds oneself. In other words, to be the author of actions is a sense of the actions that emerge from the inclinations that we find ourselves with and from the decisions that we make. Thus, even though the inclination is determined and the decision is determined, and even though the action that emerges from them naturally is determined, I am still the author of my actions. I am free because the actions emerge from the elements, that is, my own inclinations, which constitute my own will. My actions do not emerge from the inclinations of others who might coerce me to act in a certain way. However, all of these arguments in this course, the strict definition of necessity, natural laws being defined as statistical regularities, and freedom defined as being the author of one's own actions, all of these claims are really supported by the fact that, and Bergson refers to this several times in the course, the testimony of immediate consciousness. Immediate consciousness testifies that we are free. In other words, by means of a supra-intellectual intuition, we know we are free. But also, by means of the supra-intellectual intuition, we know that matter is spatial and therefore conceivable in terms of necessity. As we saw for Bergson, physics has matter for a specific object of investigation, one side of the absolute. In contrast, for Bergson, metaphysics has mind or spirit for a specific object of investigation. Unlike physics, which studies space, metaphysics studies time or duration. But despite this division of labor between physics and metaphysics, Bergson argues that through the investigation of duration, we can come to see that matter and the entire universe is composed of durations in the plural. While physics allows us to see the real genesis of matter, metaphysics allows us to see, and this is a quote from Creative Evolution, the ideal genesis of matter. This is in chapter 3. I don't know, probably all of you have taught Creative Evolution at some point. I have found these pages incredibly perplexing and really hard to explain to my students. But he does say this, the ideal genesis of matter. And he does it, he gives some images in these pages, if you remember. Thus, for Bergson, metaphysics makes contact not just with one side, but with the whole of the absolute. And this view of metaphysics leads us to the ultimate question of my presentation. How can we reach the absolute? What is this experience, the super intellectual intuition that Kant overlooked? I'm going to turn to some images, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, but again, I'm going to put them in a certain order. I hope will be somewhat illuminating or at least interesting. So, the image of the inverted cone in matter of memory, the spring or coil of the will, this is actually from chapter 3 of Creative Evolution. And the consciousness of the color orange, which is from Introduction to Metaphysics, which is the ending, it appears at the very end of part 1 of that long essay. So here's my conclusion. So let's start by recalling the key to all Bergson's thinking, which is the idea of a qualitative multiplicity. As you recall, qualitative multiplicity is defined as continuous, heterogeneous, and moving. Despite it being a geometrical form, the inverted cone of memory, which is the first image I'm presenting to you, to reach the absolute, is continuous, heterogeneous, and in motion. I have it on my paper here. I'm sure you all have memorized this since you were students of Bergson. So you remember the horizontal lines in the cone represent periods or planes of the past. The inverted cone image is able to represent the movement of memory because Bergson tells us the cone can rotate like a child's top, thereby bringing certain memories from the back to the front so they can descend from the base into the present, which is the apex of the cone. It's inverted, obviously. But memory also moves insofar as it contracts our personal memories into a point, which is the present action. And it relaxes our memories into an expanse as the cone broadens out, which is the past. The contraction is the effort of the will to bring the past to bear on the present, is when we are most conscious, when we are most awake. The relaxation, in contrast, and recall that qualitative multiplicity is dualistic at the extremes, is the lack of conscious effort, is when we are least conscious. The least conscious is what we experience in dreams and daydreams, where the images appear discontinuously. There seems to be no progress from one to the other, and therefore they seem to be nearly spatially separated. Thus, the movement of relaxation and contraction between the base and the apex of the cone represents for Bergson the movement from matter to mind. The cone image also shows us that Bergsonian intuition is not perception, which, as you all know, is always focused on the present. Intuition must be understood as an act of memory, so that we experience the continuous progress from the past to the present. Intuition must be a dilation, a widening, or even an opening of the mind to something other than the present. This brings me to the second image, which is from Creative Evolution in this section called The Ideal Genesis of Matter. And I mean, this image is very helpful. And there's also an image of a steam engine with steam escaping and falling to the ground. But I'm not going to focus on that one. This is a different image. So in these pages, Bergson tells us to make an effort to plunge back into pure duration. In the pure duration, the past is constantly swelling from all the new nows. But then he tells us that at the same time, we feel the spring, and the French word is ressort, the spring of our will winding itself tight to its utmost limit. We have to contract violently, that's actually his adverb, violently our personality upon itself, so we gather up the past that is slipping away. And then we thrust our will, compact and undivided, into a present it will create by entering it. But then Bergson tells us that we should relax the spring of our will. Once the relaxation is complete, we find neither memory nor will. At that moment of complete relaxation, we then get a glimpse of an existence made of nows that come forward one after another, one disappearing before the other appears. We no longer have the duration. Instead, we have entered matter. Matter for Bergson is composed of discontinuous instants, like the discontinuous dreams we have when we are asleep. Being discontinuous, matter is spatial, not temporal or durational, and as spatial can be mathematized. What is most important here for me is the image of the will, which is the height of mind or spirit. Bergson asks us to imagine our will as a spring or a coil. We were supposed to imagine that we are tightening the coil of our will to accumulate energy and to release the energy of the will in order to produce free action in the present, an action that is new and creative. But like any spring, the will does not have to be wound tight. The coil can be relaxed. So you saw in the cone memory image, the will can contract itself or relax itself. When it relaxes itself or lets itself go, the will dissipates into rules of habit, which require that things be separate. The movement is from pure mind to pure matter. Therefore, the move from contraction to relaxation, or vice versa, is the very movement of the absolute. Here we should note that when we contract our will to its limit, when we tighten the spring of our will to the maximum energy it can possess, Bergson thinks that we are in contact with God. Later in the two sources, of course, as you all know, Bergson identifies intuition with mystical experience. And now this is the third image from Introduction to Metaphysics, which is the consciousness of the color orange. Now, Bergson says if we plunge into our duration, we might think that there is no other duration than our own. You can see I'm circling back to the problem of the relativity of knowledge here. No other duration than our own. Just as there might be no other color in the world than orange. But as he goes on, if we sympathize with orange from the inside rather than perceiving it from the outside, then the consciousness of orange would feel itself, and there I have the French, se sentirait, would feel itself placed between red and yellow. The color consciousness of orange would intuit. There's no good way to translate in English, pressentir. So I'm using intuit. Would intuit a whole color spectrum to which the continuity going from red to yellow is prolonged. Similarly, with the intuition of my own duration, mine alone, I would have an intuition that I'm in contact with the whole continuity of durations that we should try to follow either downward into matter or upward into mind. This image shows us that Bergsonian intuition is not solipsistic, that there are always other durations continuous with mind alone. As Bergson says, we would have the feeling of a certain well-defined tension whose very definiteness appears as a choice between an infinity of possible durations. Now, it should be noted here that Bergson seems to accept Plotinus's claim that the universe sympathizes with itself. Then, as with Plotinus, when we sympathize with ourselves, we sympathize with the entire universe since we are a part of the whole universe. Again, if you've read this course, but other courses also, Bergson has no lack of praise for Plotinus. So constantly returning to him. Now, based on these three images, and this might seem very bold, I'm going to present a set of instructions. A lot of the things I've written as I've gotten older, you'll see I have a set of instructions for doing things. And I know that some of you are also admirers of Deleuze. I don't know if you've ever noticed this reading Deleuze, even though it's so hard to understand his writing sometimes, there's always a time where he'll lay things out in steps. Do this, do that, then do this. So I'm going to follow Deleuze's example here and do this in a number of steps for actualizing our power to reach the absolute. Or to put this more modestly, instructions for understanding ourselves as one tension among a series of other tensions. So here we go. So first of all, we must violently contract our personality on itself. In other words, we must make the most vigorous effort to turn back away from our habits of thought, habits which are rooted in utilitarian interests and focused always on the present. Only if we can break through these cognitive habits, we'll be able to dilate our mind to intuit the continuous progress from the past to the present. In other words, we must force ourselves to remember our own evolution through different planes of the past. Therefore, the first thing you have to do is engage not in perception, but in memory. In short, the first thing you have to do is remember. And then second, while remembering, we must be as awake as possible. We must contract our will as tight as we can. We must draw as much of the past as we can into the will. So this would mean bring all of our learning and experiences to bear on the will. This maximum accumulation of the past provides energy for the will, what Bergson, of course, calls spiritual energy. But then release the energy into an action, into a creation. When we collect and release energy into a creative act, then we become spiritualized. As I've said a couple of times, Bergson would add, we come into contact with God. Now, Bergson is clear, which I think is a really important comment, that these two steps occur rarely. Just like he says, true free actions occur very rarely. Most of the time, we cannot break free of our utilitarian interests and our cognitive habits, which might explain the skepticism that philosophers of the 20th and 21st century have about us being able to reach at least something like the absolute. But to continue with the instructions, third, stop drawing energy into the will. Instead, let yourself go. Let yourself daydream. And as we said above, the different images that appear in a daydream are discontinuous and nearly spatialized, and therefore nearly materialized. But also by daydreaming, by almost falling asleep, you descend into your body, and then biochemical processes take over. Biochemical processes are, of course, bound to necessary natural laws. In other words, we descend into matter, we become material. By ascending into spirit and descending into matter, we come to sympathize with the entire universe. We humans are one duration within a continuity of durations. Then if our duration is continuous with all the others, if we are not closed off, and this is my conclusion here, how could we not be moved to love all humans, all animals, and all things? The affirmation of unconditional love is, of course, the principal message of Bergson's last book, The Two Sources. But it also allows us to go back to the essay and understand why he says that sympathy is a moral feeling. So thank you.
Thank you, Len, for your wonderful exposition. I need a moment here to, okay. Okay, I will read a short comment that I wrote, and after this, I make a question, and after we debate, we open to the public. It's okay? Okay. Okay. I must say that I considered your exposition, your paper, very thought-provoking, and I will try to say why. Yeah? Well, your clear and precise exposition offers us a new keys for reading notions that are capital to Bergson's thought. I would mention especially the understanding of the absolute moving or absolute as a movement between the different degrees of tension or planes of the being duration. Absolute, which you call becoming order. This characterization follows, which is no less original, from the approach since the essay between superintellectual intuition and morality, sympathy as a moral feeling. This is a kind of new for me. The connection between the description of pity and self-sympathy as a sensible dimension, sensible in a sense very precise, a profound feeling. This means the very sense of intuition, the connection between this description is between the description and intuition seems to me to support the indications on how to reach the absolute. This connection, I would say, is done through an examen of the relation between Bergson and Kant. This is the point. This exam, of some anti-Kantian arguments enables a new regard on intuition, considering it, a strong idea, as an eminent act of memory, an act that allows us to live the continuous progress from the past to the present and vice versa, an act through which our mind concretely affects the opening to something beyond the present. I would like to observe, just out of curiosity, how Bergsonian is the way chosen by you to expose the indications on how to reach the absolute. First, you start from supra-intellectual intuition, sympathy, a moral feeling that is a qualitative progress. Then you write Kantian ideas or Bergson's ideas about Kant, reframing them. And finally, you follow the three crucial images, suggestions that lead to the metaphysical knowledge, or you lead your reader to an intuition by these images. To show how we can reach, according to Bergson, the absolute, you examine the encounter between Bergson and Kant's thought, exploring a special type of anti-Kantianism. It is this anti-Kantianism the point I want to problematize or question. Thus, qualitative multiplicity, the key concept in Bergson's philosophy, which is essentially continuity, heterogeneity, and transformation, mobility or progress, sustains our ability to reach the absolute. This means that we reach it when we get in contact with the different tensions of our inner life or interior life. It seems that, according to you, the positive elaboration of anti-Kantian arguments defended by Bergson is the link between qualitative multiplicity and the three crucial images that suggest the absolute that lives in us. We have discussed some of Bergson's positions. You have discussed some of Bergson's positions that are particularly insightful. Kant would be the quintessence of the modern thought. But for explaining the success of the natural science, of affirming the possibility of freedom as an act of self-creation, give once for all. Excuse me, he would be the quintessence both for explaining the success and affirming the possibility of freedom. In short, two fundamental Kantian ideas are Bergson's target: the success of the natural science that implies, however, the relativity, the possibility that there is freedom, at least impersonal or general, as an act of self-creation that would be atemporal. Bergson's position towards such theses cannot simply be characterized as acceptance or refusal. The success and confidence in physics is assumed and valued in his philosophy. But the potentiality it carries for reaching the absolute in matter, plus the potentiality it carries for reaching the absolute in matter. I understand that your text shows this position clearly, offering reinforcement for this incorporation of Kant's critical philosophy into philosophical elaboration of intuitive metaphysics. In other terms, if Kant was able to justify the success of the science of nature, of mathematical physics, without appealing to God, he did so at the cost of considering science relative. Relativity is the counterpart of the agreement between transcendental subjectivity, the forms of sensibility and categories of understanding, and the object of knowledge as phenomenon or appearance, by thus determining the unity or affinity between science and the idea of nature. He would have started the road to the metaphysical convergence between specialization, tendency of intelligence, and extension, tendency of matter. This means to Bergson thesis. I will try to be more specific, even if I repeat a little. For his part, Bergson attempts to demonstrate that mathematized physics knows matter absolutely. His argument is that our intelligence has evolved toward specialization. exteriorizing and modeling itself by the structure of matter, considering, therefore, the time of evolution. In Bergson's analysis of qualitative multiplicity by differentiation from quantitative multiplicity, Kant's presence is remarkable. The two Kantian forms of sensibility, space and time, are unified by Bergson into a form proper to intelligence, a faculty of the human species, developed in adherence to the movement of extension, which is the essence of materiality. Here, it seems to me, there is a continuity and an amplification of a philosophical intuition present in Kant. I consider that the sequence of your position shows in the positive elaboration of the so-called anti-Kantian arguments, this other possibility for us to evaluate the weight of the German philosopher in the new metaphysics, which is not pre-critical. This metaphysics, this new metaphysics, Bergsonian metaphysics, is not pre-critical, as Camille Riquier reminds us in a well-known article, La relève intuitive de la métaphysique, le kantisme de Bergson. In this sense, the analysis of freedom is even more revealing. What you have shown in Bergson's position is an attempt to balance Kant's excessive thesis without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In this context, the contraposition between general impersonal freedom and personal singular freedom, that is freedoms, takes place under the more essential idea that an act of self-creation, création de soi par soi, imposes itself with compelling evidence for both philosophers. In short, your exposition also proceeds by defending an interpretation of supra-intellectual intuition as self-sympathy and the absolute as movement or becoming other through a re-elaboration maybe of Kantian theses and arguments. Both in the theory of knowledge and the theory of moral action, Kant's merit was to find the limit of the capacities of understanding and reason, but for this very reason was to open the horizon of overcoming them. Bergson would then, by seeing what Kant did not, have extended Kantian directions. This idea is partially shared by Camille Riquier, without, however, accepting the epithet of post-Kantianism, an epithet that I consider carefully. In my case, my attention was drawn by the third stage of your argument, insofar as it leaves between the lines such continuity, by showing the positive elaboration of Bergsonian critique of Kant. If I would be very synthetic, I would say Kant's philosophy is an internal stage of Bergson metaphysics, or it all happens as, tout se passe comme si, if Kant had completely decoded the present of experience, and Bergson would come to inflate the past into that framework. The connection between Bergson and Kant as exposed in your conference, also bring elements to think about a question that I would dare to call classic regarding Bergsonian intuition. In essence, the question is that of the relation between intuition as creative emotion and intuition as philosophical method. Or, in your words, the relation between, by one side, the feeling of self-sympathy, the superintellectual intuition, which can be understood as inspiration, and by the other side, the theoretical conceptual analysis, the argumentation about experience, time, and the absolute. Now, we know that methodologically, Bergson advances through the articulation between criticism and positive metaphysics. Criticism, in turn, operates by differentiation in nature, criticism in a Bergsonian way. According to Deleuze, for instance, and Bento Prado Jr., This method starts from experience and finds in experience itself its conditions, which are pure tendencies. This is famous. There is here a work of abstraction or idealization that retakes the empirical transcendental pair. This means that proceeds in a Kantian key. So, despite the quote, this is my question, despite the quote that you brought very sagaciously in your text, rien de plus contraire à la lettre et peut-être aussi à l'esprit de la critique de la raison pure, la quotation of creative evolution, could we argue that Bergson is more Kantian than he would wish? And how would your definition about intuition fit in this problem of feeling and theoretical method? I have another question, but I will save, I will wait. But this is, I try to reconstruct your argument to propose this question, Len. And
thank you for
once more
comments.
time, thank you. Okay.
No, thank you for the comments. They're really great. Not sure how to respond to it. I mean, I don't know. The editor of the volume for which I wrote this also complained to me that Bergson didn't understand Kant, and that there were facets of Kant that anticipated what I was saying about Bergson. But I'm not sure. I still think the quotes that I brought together are certainly put him in the category of opposing his thinking to Kant. And maybe this is just a biographical, question about how much Kant he actually knew. But there is in this course from 1904, 1905, he has actually reflections on the history of philosophy, and I mean how to read the history of philosophy. And maybe this is all things we already think, but he says that no philosopher is remembered for the criticisms he makes, but only for the positive contributions. And anyone that just criticizes is forgotten, is not included into the history of philosophy. So that kind of comment, which is early in the course, like the third lecture, would reinforce what you're saying, Débora, because he would have to say, well, Kant, he's going to write on Kant, and therefore there must be something positive that in Kant's theory that he could, see as valuable for the history of philosophy and therefore develop. And I might have overstated. I certainly wasn't suggesting that, I was trying not to suggest that Bergson's philosophy is pre-Kantian. I mean, he doesn't think, maybe I am saying that, I don't know. I mean, these are such difficult questions how to interpret these figures. Because I was going to say he's not pre-Kantian, but I think one of the things that inspires Bergson is Leibniz's idea of the micro-perceptions, the petit perception. And because that's also a way of thinking, well, there is this background, but I can still have a kind of micro-perception of it, a little perception of it. So I have some access to it. And that's not perception as such in Leibniz. That's really something different. But that would make, it's a long way to say that maybe Bergson is pre-Kantian because I can associate it so quickly with Leibniz. But yeah, So I agree that maybe I overstated things a little bit just to make my argument or make Bergson's argument against Kant as clear as possible. I mean, you're right. I mean, that's why I wanted to stress and was hesitating at the beginning before he formally started. When Bergson says that Kant has the quintessence of knowledge and freedom, that he developed this essence, this super essence even, that obviously that's a very positive part of Kant's philosophy. But it is the boldness of Bergson's claim that our knowledge is absolute, introduction to metaphysics, that seems very un-Kantian still to me. So I also don't have a good answer to the other question. I shouldn't go on so long. Maybe there's other questions from other people in the audience. But just I don't have a good answer to the question about, and I think you're right. I mean, I was going too quickly from intuition as a philosophical method or a philosophical tool even, to intuition as a creative emotion, a source of inspiration or a mystical experience. Because Bergson himself doesn't actually make that identification, does not, in the two sources. And but it seems pretty clear. The descriptions are very similar of the two things: creative emotion in chapter 1 and intuition in Introduction to Metaphysics. So, but yeah, I think some sort of transition would need to be constructed between those two uses of intuition. Yeah, one more theoretical, one more practical. So yeah, I don't have a good story to tell about that. So
yeah. Thank you, Len. But I would like to say that the third part of your text, it's the part that touched me more because of my reflections about Kant-Bergson relationship. And I think that you did something very special there, because you shown that the positive elaboration of Kant arguments as a way to show how Bergson appropriates or push something from Kant by insuffling or by yes is
by breathing Kantianism in. Yeah, you're right.
Yes. Thank you very much. It was very a great pleasure for me to read and to think about your text. It's the sense of our network, I think. And well, I will open for the public to make questions if they want. Someone? Okay, we have Hisashi. Yes, I forgot to mention that I read Hisashi Fujita's text about Bergson Heidegger, and in this text I saw how we can see in matter and memory a tentative to solve the problems of schematism. Am I right? I don't know, but I related both of the texts. Hisashi, please, you can make your question. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Len, for your rich presentation. And of course, now we're at almost 5 a.m. in Japan, and I'm very tired. So I'm not sure that if I could understand your argument well, but still, so I have 2 questions. One small historical one. So I think you stressed the importance of the lecture of 1904-1905 on the evolution of freedom. And you said that in this conference, so he, developed the most his argument on Kant. So my first question is very historical. So why after that he, in a way, minimized this argument in a creative evolution? Of course, in creative evolution, he developed much on Kant, but still so relatively small if we follow your argument. So because this kind of change is very important. For example, for Plotinus, he developed much in a course on the history of time, of the idea of time. But after that, he reduced much his argument on Plotinus. And this kind of minimization of proteinase is very important in as Camille Riquier stressed. So my question is same. So in the same direction. So why Bergson in Creative Evolution minimized his argument on Kant? So, and the second one. Second question is concerns your how to say separation between perception and memory. I think you said that your interpretation on intelligence intuition is based on the memory. But however, for me, always for Bergson, in Bergson's word, what is important is the intuition is reflection. So how to reach the absolute must have two ways. So must have the expression of the intuition. So the intuition must involve the expression of the intuition. And then for me, the difference between Bergson and Kant is precisely on this. Bergson could express the intuition. I think it is very important. And this is why. So I think on your you talked about the three images of this intuition, and the first one is for me it is very disputable, because you said that dilatation is the dilatation of intuition is in this kind of movement or towards the memory, the pure memory. But for me, it's how to say, without expression. You can't express this intuition by going to the pure memory. We must go also at the same time towards another direction. So I think this separation between perception and memory is how to say, in a way, on the way of the intuition, but not the entire system of intuition. So this is my second question. Perhaps it's related with understanding of the turning of le tournant de l'expérience. Because for me, so perhaps the more appropriate image of the intuition is perhaps the dynamic, the schema dynamique, and not perhaps the inverted cone. Yes, this is my second question. Thank
you. Thank you. Those are great questions. The first one I never really considered. I mean, I noticed the reduction of the discussions in fourth chapter, Creative Evolution of Kant and Plotinus, and but I didn't think why that would have happened until you posed the question. I mean, so I only have kind of like obvious answers. I just think this is one of the interesting things about reading these courses is that Bergson really sees himself as a teacher. And therefore, he wants to explain things to the students. And that always requires more detail than you would put into a published work. At least that's, I mean, this is borne out by lots of courses I've read, even Heidegger's courses seem to be really, even though you can hear Heidegger's ideas animating his lectures in the courses, it's still, there is still an attempt to explain things to the audience, to the students. So we could explain the difference between the two texts, the course and Creative Evolution, by means of the purpose of them. Again, I would have to do a lot more investigation to come up with an answer I'd be confident in saying. That's just my first reaction to your question. And the second question is much more complicated. I almost was going to say this might be controversial, to assert the role of memory in intuition, but I wasn't sure anymore. But that was still controversial. I was taking seriously Bergson's, first chapter in Matter and Memory, where perception is so utilitarian and so geared to matter that I wanted to separate intuition from perception. I know that some of the older, earlier texts, scholarship on Bergson, seem to conflate perception with intuition. And even if you read Merleau-Ponty, you might think that's true as well. And but I really don't think that's the case. I think intuition is something else. But I agree. It's interesting you brought up the idea of dynamic schema, which I've also written on Intellectual Effort, that essay by Bergson. And it's an interesting point to bring up. I don't know how that would fit into my story. Because obviously the way he explains dynamic schema there, it's again, I found this hard to imagine. I mean, maybe this was common in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, that there would be, or maybe it's so common today. I don't follow chess as a sport, and but I mean, he describes a chess player playing multiple games of chess blindfolded. And if anyone can do that, I'm in admiration. I mean, I couldn't imagine how this happens. But I mean, that's how he starts explaining this idea of dynamic schema, or he uses the idea of dynamic schema to explain that ability. But obviously, that's much closer to practical things, and not theoretical things. I mean, it's still playing a game, which doesn't quite make it practical, but still it's about use of your body, manipulating things and things like that. And that's really an interesting comment. I just hadn't thought about that much, how that would fit in. But I mean, but just to defend myself a little bit, I wasn't saying that intuition is solely memory. It is the movement back and forth. And obviously some of the phrases I had were invoking the turn on to experience in Matter and Memory. But I didn't really see that discussion as an image. I mean, maybe it has the idea of descent in it, I guess, if I remember correctly, but still these other images seem much more illuminating, I guess is the right word. But I agree with you. I mean, and you asked multiple questions. I'm trying to remember all of them. But you also asked about expression, and I think that's true. Bergson does find a way of expressing it, but he does say all the time that intuition is inexpressible. And in the introduction to La Pensée Le Mouvant, he appeals to images and says that this is an intellectual, this is a philosophical intuition, that essay in the book, that we can approach an intuition through the images. But that's a kind of expression that is still not completely faithful to the experience that we have in intuition. And it's interesting that at least in this course, 1904-1905 course, he refers to the testimony of consciousness. So the testimony is not exactly, the thing itself. It's actually something, a little bit distant from it, like an image. So whenever the word testimony appears in philosophers, I always pause. I mean, there's very few philosophers actually write about it, but it seems to be one of these things that you put in when you don't quite know what you're talking about. Say testimony, it's like you can't find a good word to describe it. But I think Bergson finds a way of expressing it, but it's still not a perfect expression, it's because it's always through images. So, or he in the introduction to La Pensée Le Mouvant, he mentions fluid concepts, but I'm not sure what that means. I mean, I can imagine it, but it's still a technical definition of what a fluid concept is. I really would take a lot of work, a lot of investigation to find that. So thank you. Those are great questions. And thank you both, Débora and Hishashi, for those questions.
Thank you.
Bruno, yeah. freedom. Yeah.
Hi, Len. Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't know if I can put my question. I'm just thinking about the things you guys are saying, and my question is more about, like, you have two ways of thinking freedom, right? One way will be, at least one way will be to think freedom as something related to destiny. So we have to follow things from outside us, right? So there's something that it's happening outside, and we have to follow this thing happening outside so we can be free. And the other idea will be the opposite, to be related to autonomy, to be detached from the exterior and to be oneself in the most deeply sense. So I think Bergson, he goes from one way to another, because sometimes in matter of memory, intuition is not only to reconstruct or to be within my own memory, is also to reconcile myself with the universe. But on the other hand, in Time and Free Will, and also in Creative Evolution, and even matter of memory, freedom is also this introspection journey throughout ourselves. So how could you reconcile these two different, apparently at least, images or ideas of freedom? I'm just thinking about, I don't know, Max Scheler, for example, to have an example, when he relates epoche with spiritual exercises, this kind of, so the method is the philosophical method is related to this idea of being outside the world, kind of, right? Or even Foucault, the last Foucault, that will also be towards this thinking, I mean, this thought of ataraxia, the Greek idea of being outside, kind of. So how would you reconcile to, if it is opposite, I don't know, this relation to the universe, and at the same time this relation with ourselves? That's my question. I don't know if I put it well, but I'm just trying to, yeah.
No, I think I think I understand. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe I mixed ideas together that shouldn't be mixed together, but I mean, certainly the idea of freedom that he has in the course is not exactly the idea of freedom he has in the essay, where it is much more associated with a feeling, or with the duration, the movement of the duration itself is freedom. But it seems in the courses, or this course in particular, it really is the idea of free decision. And so yeah, I mean, Bergson never writes about spiritual exercise, but certainly when he says that metaphysics or philosophy is speculative, not utilitarian, that suggests a kind of contact with something outside of, at least, of everyday life. But that's, again, more of a more of a theoretical endeavor, speculative endeavor, than actually, performing conducts in life. And so I do think, I mean, he doesn't, when he writes about the ancients, he never talks about spiritual exercises. I mean, so I don't know what he thinks about that, but I mentioned in passing during the talk, where he valorizes asceticism at the end of the two sources, as a opposing pole to what he calls aphrodisiasm, being sexual, and so there's no development of that idea that I know of in Bergson, but it's not alien to his thinking. And just a little other thing. I mean, I know you've all studied an Introduction to Metaphysics. This is such a famous essay, and has such a good summary of his thinking up to that point, to 1903. And But I always stress, when I teach the text, I always stress the last page. I always start with the last page of the text, because there he says that there is no intuition possible without considerable learning. So, which means it isn't, again, something that you can just say, I'm bringing this page up because it has something, it suggests a kind of spiritual exercise or practice that you have to actually enter into all the ideas, you have to study all the books. And then at a certain moment, intuition might come to you. But you can't sit down as a philosopher and say, I have an intuition about freedom and start writing about it. Or someone would think that's not a true intuition. You have to study the history of philosophy on the question of freedom, and then you might have an intuition. But again, this is why you go back to Debora's comments about the practical versus the theoretical. I mean, I think practical, it's a theory of freedom being developed in the course, but it's really a theory of freedom about free choice. And so again, the idea of freedoms, personal freedom. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but that's maybe the starting point.
The word instruction got my attention when you said,
right.
Because
Yeah.
that's why I start thinking about like this, because it's an act of will, right? There's something that you have to want, kind of. So what is the meaning of this will, if it has to coincide with the universe, but at the same time to dig inside ourselves? That was because of the wording,
I understand better. Yeah, it's a complication I didn't consider, right? I mean, I have an easy answer to the question. I mean, all of you know that how often the word effort, F4, appears in Bergson's writings, and but there has to be a kind of effort to do what all of us have done, accumulate lots and lots of knowledge of learning in order to come to something like, put it again modestly, an understanding of an idea. So that effort is part of, I did have the word learning in my instructions to make all of our learning bear upon the present. So, but it is an act of will just to even start the process of accumulating the knowledge, which would lead to an intuition. But maybe that's still not a very good answer to your question. Yeah, I need to think about that some more. So unfortunately, the paper is in production, so I can't revise it anymore. So it will appear, and you can write a damning review of the book. And so it's like,
It's okay.
But thank you. You partially answered. Yeah.
Yes. And it's okay. I think it's a little late, and I think it's better than we can end our activities. I would like to thank Len, another way, to the conference, to participate, all the others that presented their text, the public, and especially Emily, Herring, and Katerina for all the structure that they gave to us. And I would like to invite everybody to our next encounter, not next video meeting. It's next Thursday, okay? And it's I don't know if Katerina wants to say